So IOLERO was born out of a shooting death here in Sonoma County. This was the death of Andy Lopez, which hopefully many of you remember. It was about 10 years ago in October, that Andy Lopez was killed by a sheriff's deputy here in Sonoma County. I'm going to talk a little bit about that case because I think it helps us understand what the community interest was in creating IOLERO and how we came to understand the goals of IOLERO. So Andy Lopez was a young man who was returning an airsoft rifle, a BB gun, to a friend one day in his neighborhood in the Moreland area, which at the time was an unincorporated part of the county and is now, well, the areas immediately around it are now part of the city of Santa Rosa. So at the time, the sheriff's deputies of the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office were responsible for patrolling that area. And they got a call that someone was walking in the area with a gun. And at the time, there was enough gun violence in that particular neighborhood that people were concerned about this issue. So on the one hand, you have Andy Lopez, a 13-year-old kid who's returning a toy gun to a friend walking down the street. On the other hand, you have two sheriff's deputies in a car, one of them fairly senior and a war veteran with some combat experience, and the other a rookie who is brand new and out in training still in the field. And so as the two sheriff's deputies pulled up, they see someone walking along with what appears to be an assault rifle. So they end up doing what is fairly normal, at least at the beginning, for any kind of sheriff's deputy, which is to activate the lights on their car, stop the car, tell this person to stop. Andy Lopez, starts to turn around, and the deputies fire their weapons at him, killing him right there on the spot. One of the things that makes this complicated is that the gun itself, this replica toy gun, originally had an orange tip painted on one end by the manufacturer, and that had been removed. So the gun at that point was difficult to distinguish, especially at a distance, from a real AK-47. This is a set of pictures of an actual AK-47 on the top and the toy gun that Andy Lopez was carrying on the bottom. So depending on one's perspective, there are some people who looked at this and thought this is a horrific tragedy. There wasn't much the sheriff's deputies could have done differently. There are other people who felt the sheriff's deputies acted too fast, were not taking into account the size and age of Andy Lopez, and that had they reacted more calmly and a little more slowly, that this would have resolved peacefully and Andy Lopez would have simply dropped the toy gun and this all would have been resolved pretty quickly. These two perspectives ended up creating tremendous conflict here in Sonoma County. So the fact that this incident was perceived so differently by different people, some in the sheriff's office and some in the community, created tremendous tension. If you want some more information about, about Andy Lopez and this particular shooting, this is a link you can go to find out a little more. So after Andy Lopez was killed, there were a number of protest marches in the city of Santa Rosa and in the county in general. There was a lot of pressure on the sheriff's office to alter their approach to use of force. There were many in the community that felt they were moving too fast. There was, I think, a pent-up demand from especially people in the Latino community to see a different relationship between that community and law enforcement. And so the shooting became emblematic of long-standing simmering unrest between law enforcement community and the Latino community in general. And pressure began to mount on the county to create some kind of an oversight system for the sheriff's office. Because at the time, the only real feedback, public feedback that the sheriff's office had set up, like almost all sheriff's offices in California, was that the sheriff would stand for re-election every 4 years. And other than that, there really was no control, input, oversight over the sheriff's office. Even the county board of supervisors, as a result of some state laws, had very little control over anything the sheriff might choose to do with the sheriff's resources. Really, the only thing that the county could do was set a dollar amount for the sheriff's office budget, and that was about it. So in response to this concern, as that's going on, at the same time, there were criminal and civil cases that were pending out of this situation. As is true, anytime a police officer or a sheriff's deputy shoots somebody in the line of duty, there's an inquiry to see if that sheriff's deputy or police officer committed a crime. Here in Sonoma County, that inquiry is initially done by the Sonoma County District Attorney's Office. That office chose not to file charges in that case. And that was, I think, in large part because state law was very deferential to police officers and sheriff's deputies at the time. As long as there was some, they could articulate some reasonable belief that they thought they were looking at a real weapon, then state law allowed them to shoot. Not everyone agreed that that ought to be the way state law was written, but that was state law at the time. Likewise, the U.S. Department of Justice did not file criminal charges. They sometimes do that in cases like this. The federal standards are a little bit higher, were a little bit higher at the time, but still very deferential to police officers. Totally separately, the family of Andy Lopez filed a civil case. And just as a reminder, in a civil case, what they're looking for in a civil case is to resolve the situation with some kind of compensation. And in this case, they alleged a violation of Andy Lopez's civil rights. What was intriguing about those cases is they went through several levels of appeal, and at the end of the day, several courts concluded that a jury could reasonably conclude that the officers had overreacted and that the case would have to go to a jury trial to resolve that question. And as a result of that, the county ended up settling the case for $3 million. It's obviously not a small sum. So these varying resolutions, I think, fueled the public concern that it was not clear to the public that there was an effective means of overseeing the sheriff's office. Criminal charges were not a way to do that, either at the state or federal level. There was a civil case, on the other hand, which resulted in a very large amount of money going to the family. And so many people in the community said, well, look, if you look at that result, we can't rely on the criminal system to provide the oversight that we want. The civil system seems to have created some accountability here, but on the other hand, well after the events occurred, and not in any kind of proactive way that would have prevented Andy Lopez from dying. So what can we do differently that might create a different feedback loop, a different way to have conversation between community and the sheriff's office to try to alter the way that the sheriff's office is policing the community? So that resulted in the creation of something called the CAE Task Force. So this was an effort by the County Board of Supervisors to put together a set of folks from many different segments of the Sonoma County community. Included in the group were people from county government, people from the city of Santa Rosa, city government, people from the sheriff's office, people from community, particularly people from the Latino community. And the idea of this task force was to figure out, well, how can we create some kind of independent civilian review or oversight of the sheriff's office? Well, what does that mean? What would that look like? I'll talk a little bit about what these civilian oversight models look like generally. Before I get to that, are there some other questions, if any, about the Andy Lopez shooting? I don't see any in the chat. Not seeing any hands raised. Okay, I'll keep going then, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this next part of the presentation. So civilian oversight of law enforcement. I think a fair short summary of the idea behind civilian oversight of law enforcement is to include community in decisions about local law enforcement, figuring out what the policies are, figuring out what the enforcement priorities are, having some kind of, again, conversation or feedback loop between community and law enforcement. Traditionally, especially in the late 20th century, there was not a lot of feedback from community to law enforcement and vice versa, other than through the chief executive of the agency. And even then, the typical patterns that we saw in late 20th century tended to be fairly secretive. There was a strong belief by many in law enforcement that explaining or even showing to people what their policies or training might be could be unsafe for police officers and sheriff's deputies. Today, we have a very different set of expectations, but that was the case for a long time. There was, I think, a tendency to engage only with people who were happy with the law enforcement services they were receiving and not people who were unhappy. And so as a result, conversation fairly shut down. Now, this idea of civilian oversight of law enforcement has been around for a long time. There are models as early as the late 1800s and early 20th century, but our trend recently has been in the last 20 years to try to create civilian professionals who might investigate claims of police misconduct instead of having police investigate themselves, on the theory that that can create a higher degree of accountability for individual officers or deputies and greater transparency for the public about why one instance, like the death of Andy Lopez, resulted in discipline of an officer or did not result in discipline of an officer. Another tool we see in civilian oversight today is having community members involved in police policy decisions, usually with a board or a commission. And a third one is engaging the community more in selecting law enforcement leaders. And so in a lot of places, we now see ways in which the community is actively involved in picking the next chief executive of the law enforcement agency. Now, for that last one in California, it's a hard and fast rule throughout the state that all sheriffs are elected. And the state constitution sets up a series of patterns about how and when those elections happen, much like a lot of other county officers, like the members of the Board of Supervisors. So in that regard, there's already a very specific path created by state law to have community engaged in selecting the leadership of the sheriff's office, and that's solely to elect the sheriff, and that's it. There is a very strong rule that there's really nothing else the community can do in that regard. The state has for a long time prioritized the independence of the elected sheriff. So our options in a place like Sonoma County are really these first two issues, having civilian professionals investigate claims of police misconduct and including community members in police policy decisions. I'll give you some examples. One way this is sometimes done is with an auditor or review model. That's what we have here in Sonoma County now at IOLERO. We have civilian professionals like me that double check the investigations that are completed by police or sheriff's offices about their own personnel. In this regard, we're reacting to the work that the sheriff's office has already done. It's not by itself directive or proactive. We're always taking a look at an event that already occurred and seeing what discipline or corrective action or change in policy or training should happen afterwards. There's also an investigative model. We do not have that very much here in Sonoma County, with a couple exceptions I'll talk about in a few minutes. But in those kinds of cases, civilian professionals directly investigate disciplinary cases against police officers, separate from those criminal or civil cases we talked about earlier. And in that regard, that model it's reactive in that we're reacting to something that a sheriff's deputy did, but it's also directive in that it sets a path for what's going to happen with that case afterwards. And then finally, there are community boards and commissions that might supervise these other two models. They might hold hearings in specific disciplinary cases. They might direct or suggest some change in policy for the law enforcement agency. Some of them are involved in selecting department heads like a chief of police. Here in Sonoma County, we now have, as a result of the work of the CAE task force, a community board and commission called the Community Advisory Council, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So we have a couple different aspects of these sorts of oversight. If you find this interesting, this is a website, nacol.org, that has a lot more information about how civilian oversight systems are created, and they have a great document on there called "What is Meaningful Civilian Oversight?" that talks about all the different models one can see. And in fact, if you're interested in learning more about civilian oversight of law enforcement, say for maybe a city that you're involved in here in Sonoma County, NACOL offers some great training opportunities. These are some links that are embedded in the PowerPoint that you can use later if you want to learn more about those. And they also include both some written material and some webinars that you can check out about these issues in an annual conference that NACOL puts on. So what was it that CAE recommended? Well, they took a look at some of this material from NACOL, learned about the different models of oversight, and their recommendation was that there be an Office of the Independent Auditor. That's what IOLERO is now, someone who would review and double check the work of the Sheriff's Office. That's permitted by California state law. even though sheriffs are fairly independent in state law. But that review or auditing model was something that we could do here in California. And they also recommended a citizens advisory committee and a youth council. At the end of the day, the Board of Supervisors merged those last two recommendations together and just made a citizens advisory council, which could have people on it of any number of ages. And the idea from CAE that was picked up by the Board of Supervisors and then implemented in about 2016 was to actually make sure that that community advisory council was providing advice to the sheriff's office about the community's expectations and needs for policies at the sheriff's office. All of those ideas were adopted in 2016 in an ordinance that the Board of Supervisors passed. And then shortly after that, the first Community Advisory Council was created and the first IOLERO director was hired. And at the beginning, the idea here was that the IOLERO director, one of my predecessors, would simply appoint all the members of the Community Advisory Council. In the first few years, this model had some growing pains. So in the first few iterations, we had two different directors of IOLERO. They each stayed between 2 and 3 years apiece. They all appointed their own community advisory councils, which was the rule at the time. That was appropriate. But a lot of tension built up between IOLERO, that community advisory council, and the sheriff over a variety of policy issues, and also disagreements about the scope of IOLERO's authority. So there were arguments about whether IOLERO, for example, could have an opinion or express an opinion about the discipline of deputies, what information to which IOLERO had access or didn't have access, whether the sheriff would respond or not to some of the policy recommendations from the Community Advisory Council. And during this period of time, from roughly 2016 to 2020, a significant backlog of audits built up. And in addition to that, communication really broke down between both CAC and IOLERO on the one hand and the sheriff's office on the other. There just was not, there was at a time a policy at the sheriff's office of simply not responding to anything that came from those two entities. So the goal of having conversation between community and the sheriff's office was not really being accomplished. So in 2020, some voters here in Sonoma County proposed Measure P. And if memory serves, I think your organization was at some point involved in getting some information to your members about this measure, because I know that's one of your main missions. So some of you might remember having some conversations about what Measure P was back in 2020 and what its pros and cons were. Eventually, this was put onto the ballot here in Sonoma County by the Board of Supervisors in the summer of 2020. And there were some people in Sonoma County who were very strongly supportive and some people who were opposed. In particular, folks who worked at the sheriff's office, I think it's fair to say, were pretty consistently opposed to this expansion of IOLERO's powers. I'll talk in a little bit about all the details of Measure P, but I think a fair short summary was that it was going to increase and solidify the funding and the staffing for the agency, clarify answers to some of the questions that I brought up before about what IOLERO could access and what it would be able to look at. But then finally, it also created opportunity for IOLERO to directly investigate a small number of kinds of cases, usually ones where there was a fatality, like the Andy Lopez case, where, say, the sheriff's deputies killed someone or that someone died in the custody of the sheriff's department. This measure was hotly contested at the ballot box, but passed with 65% of the vote in November of 2020. I've included here in the presentation the ballot arguments and the text of Measure P if you want to take a look at that later at this blue hyperlink here at the bottom. Shortly after Measure P went into effect, the unions that represent employees of the sheriff's office pointed out that there's a requirement in California that when one changes disciplinary systems, as Measure P did by changing the way that sheriff's deputies are investigated and disciplined here in Sonoma County, that the state has to, that whichever state actor it is that's changing the rules, in this case the county, has to have some conversation with the unions that represent those employees about how that's going to go forward, how it'll be implemented. This process is called meeting and conferring. In addition to being required by state law, there's also a body at state law that acts kind of like a court to resolve disputes between employers and employee groups when either one feels that the meet and confer process hasn't gone the way it should. That's called the Public Employee Relations Board, or PERB. And they weighed in a little bit after Measure P was passed by blocking the measure and saying, hey, look, there hasn't been an opportunity yet for the county and these unions to meet and confer and talk about how this process is going to work. So very long story short, that issue ended up in litigation for some time. And while it was being litigated, the county reached some agreements with the applicable unions after having met and conferred. So it was on two tracks. So in the summer of 2022, a little bit before I started in the fall of 2023, these agreements were finally reached about how to implement it. So all this is to say that there, has been a lot of conversation in Sonoma County about how IOLERO is going to work. I'll talk a little bit about what we do now and how that works. And I'm wondering, before I get to that, if there are any questions about this whole community process that we went through. I see some statements. Don't see any questions yet. Anybody want to raise a hand, ask a question? No? Okay. I'll talk a little bit more then about what we're doing right now. So in our current operations here at IOLERO, since roughly about a year and a half ago, when I came on board, we do several different things. As I mentioned before, we review administrative investigations, right? So when someone makes a complaint about a sheriff's deputy, they might give it to us or to the sheriff's office, and either way, then it comes back to us at IOLERO to double check and review, with the exception of some minor complaints that might be made directly to the sheriff's office. We then get to take a look at the investigation that was completed by the sheriff's office, and we give them some feedback about it. Either we agree or disagree with their conclusions, think maybe it could have been done better in some way, explain why that is. We then put all those audits, those recommendations together into an annual report, and every year release that to the public so the public can see what it is that we're doing and what feedback we've given to the sheriff's office and why. We also try to put together thoughtful policy recommendations to the sheriff. Here in Sonoma County, the sheriff also happens to oversee the coroner's work, so sometimes they're called the sheriff coroner, and so we make recommendations about all of those operations to the extent that we see some ways they could be improved. And we also try to provide positive feedback where we think that's appropriate. If we think that there's something that's being done quite well at the sheriff's office, then we'll make sure to mention that also. Our goal in doing both of those two things, the audits with public release of that information and policy recommendations, is to try to create some transparency for people in the public about what's really going on at the sheriff's office, both the conduct of people in the sheriff's office, but also what their policies and procedures really are. And in the course of doing that, we try to engage the community as much as we can in finding out what's important to them, what it is that they want to see the sheriff's office doing. In terms of our staffing, I'm the director, and then we have 6 employees altogether, plus some part-time people. I have a 3-year term, so I'm a little over a year into that. And in a couple of years, the Board of Supervisors will then, get to figure out whether they want to reappoint me or pick somebody else to do the job. My position requires being an attorney. Most of our positions here at IOLERO do require being an attorney. I also have to be NACOL certified. Remember I mentioned the National Association for the Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement earlier on? That group provides a certification to people who've done enough training to show that they actually know something about the field. So I have to maintain a NACOL certification as well to do this job. We have an operations manager, kind of like an office manager, who makes sure everything's running shipshape and on time, helps us with our annual report and all of our record keeping. She has an administrative aide that assists her. We have an outreach manager who, like the operations manager, is a Sonoma State grad with a criminal justice degree. And then we also have right now two full-time and 1 part-time, hence 2.5, auditor attorneys. So these are all attorneys who are doing the work of auditing reports and also doing the direct investigations where that's required. So it's a much larger staff than we used to have. At the beginning of this model, it was just the director and 1 administrative aide, and that was it. So that's part of why there was a backlog back in 2017, 18, 19. So this fuller staffing, which was created by Measure P, has really been a big help in us catching up. So last year, for example, we caught up on that whole backlog of cases. This year, we're doing a pretty good job of keeping up on that backlog. It's challenging. It's still a tight fit, but we're making it work. If you're curious to learn more about the policies of the sheriff's office, those are now available online, which is a really big change from 10 years ago when they were not only not available to the public readily, but the sheriff's office, like a lot of law enforcement agencies at the time, would actively oppose their release to the public whenever possible. So you can now find out all kinds of things about how the sheriff's office does what it does. This is a link to a page they have that talks about how they train their deputies and what they tell them to do. You'll find in there policies about all kinds of things. It's extremely detailed. And these are all links to the various policies if you're interested in checking any of those out. The use of force policy just by itself is 13 pages long. That's 13 out of the over 1,000 pages of sheriff's office policies they have. And you can find out in there all about how they train deputies to use force or not use force. That's the material I have out of this presentation. I'm going to take a quick pause here and see if there might be some other questions. Okay, I do see one from Karen, and she said, when you are investigating a complaint, what's the process? Like, when do you get copies of the interviews, body-worn camera footage, et cetera? Great question. Well, we have two tracks in that regard. So one of our tracks is that for most of the cases that we're working on, we're doing an audit, a reactive review of the investigation the sheriff's office did to see if we think it was of quality, if it was complete, and whether we agree with the conclusions reached. In that regard, we usually get all of the materials about that case after the sheriff's office has already investigated it. Part of what we're looking at is whether they gathering the information that they needed. So, and so in that kind of case, we get all the information after the investigation's done. In cases where we're doing our own independent investigation, which should again be deputy-involved shootings, deaths in the jail, other deaths in custody or at the hands of a sheriff's deputy, we get that information much earlier. So we talk to the sheriff's office about what information they're gathering. We get to see some of that. We can gather our own information. We have subpoena power, so we could go get other pieces of information ourselves if we need to. And we're looking at, generally speaking, all the same things that folks in law enforcement would be looking at in those cases at an early stage. And then we interview the deputies ourselves and gather that information and then write a report. That aspect of our work is relatively new, so we don't have any completed reports yet using that more proactive or earlier investigative process I just described. But we will have some of those available, and some of those will be available to the public in the near future. So is it all right if I go through a few more of these questions real quick?
Yeah, I see. Yeah, you've got a couple more.
Yeah, okay, great. I'll go ahead and answer those.
Okay.
So one is that IOLERO started as a result of an incident that affected the Latino community. How aware are we of this community, and has it made any difference in the sheriff's relationship with the community? Well, there are a couple ways we do that. One is that our outreach manager and I have really focused on trying to do outreach specifically to the Latino community, and in particular to folks in the Latino community who speak only Spanish or very little English. And that outreach has largely been in Spanish. So we have, say, Spanish language radio ads. We have a Spanish language version of our website that one can link to. A lot of our materials, like our annual report, are also available in Spanish. And then we go to a lot of events where there are people from that community that we can meet, one-on-one. So this kind of presentation we sometimes do in Spanish-speaking environments, and then we also show up at, say, community festivals and fairs, and have reached out to some of the groups that serve that community directly, right? Whether that's through schools or healthcare or other kinds of community organizations, and try to get the word out about who we are. I think it's too early to know, at least from my time here, whether that's directly affected the, whether that's really directly affected the Spanish-speaking community. I think that in my experience, there are a lot of people in that community that still have real reticence about getting involved in anything relating to law enforcement. And so it has been challenging to make people comfortable enough to step forward to either make a complaint or to get involved in our community advisory council in terms of making recommendations to the sheriff's office about changes in policy. We do have a lot of people on our CAC, the Community Advisory Council, who are from the Latino community, and part of their work is also to then reach out to others in that same community and to bring those needs to IOLERO and to the sheriff's office. So every year when we talk about what our priorities are going to be for the CAC in the upcoming year, we talk in part about what we think some of the priorities are going to be for the Latino community. We have a new sheriff as of January, and he has been much more open to talking to IOLERO and the CAC than he has been in the past, and actually responds to our policy recommendations either from IOLERO or the CAC, and has changed some of the policies at the sheriff's office since we've come on board. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we have some positive direction in terms of the overall relationship with the sheriff's office. One person asked, are we getting some pushback from the sheriff's office? And I'd say, I think it's fair to say that the work that we do makes some people in the sheriff's office very anxious and probably will for a long time. But at least at the leadership level, we've seen a higher level of cooperation than we have in the past. So that's a positive. Another question. Oh, Leona, you've had your hand up for a little bit. Would you like to throw a question in? Sorry, I was slow to recognize
I'm having trouble with my chat here. I keep wanting to send a direct message to Lynn, which I didn't want to do. I recently attended a the Commission on Human Rights here in Sonoma County. Do you get many complaints or concerns directed from them?
Some, we have talked to them. I've made a presentation there kind of like this one. And I know that sometimes members of that commission, when they come across something that they're concerned about with respect to the sheriff's office, will send a complaint to our office. So yes, some. I know they have a lot of other issues to work on too. Another question we have in the chat is how much transparency there is into the training of police and deputies, particularly around chokeholds, and if there's potentially deadly force. There's a lot more transparency in that regard than there used to be. So those policies I put up on the screen earlier are now available publicly, and I think that's a real positive. There is also, in many cases, available body-worn camera footage of what deputies are doing in the field, so you can see how the training is playing out, how it's being implemented in the field. The training classes themselves are not quite as transparent. There are some in law enforcement that still feel very cautious about showing anyone what they're doing in any of their classes because they worry that creates a potential, particularly on use of force issues, presents some risk that other people are going to understand what law enforcement does so well that might be used against law enforcement in the field. I don't know that I agree with that concern. I think it's extremely rare that would happen, and I think that the public is better served by knowing what law enforcement is doing and why and how. But to date, there isn't a rule that requires them to make those classes public, and so most of the time they don't. I'll give you an example that I think might help a little bit. I'm going to share a different screen with you real quick. This is a PowerPoint that we gave to the Board of Supervisors recently that described our recent annual report. And one of the things that we did there was talk about some of the trends that we see over the last year in the audits we've been doing. So one of the trends, as you can see from this slide, is that there are a lot of incomplete investigations in the prior year. That was better than the year prior. So one of the things we've been able to create some transparency about is not so much the training about use of force, but what the training and the practices are about investigating their own. How is it the sheriff's office investigates its own people? We created a checklist of what we think is required in a complete investigation, and we reached agreement with the sheriff's office that that's the metric we would be using in the future. We now are able to use that to create some consistency in our audits, but also to set expectations for the sheriff's office from the community about what we expect them to do in their IA investigations. In the most recent cycle, we found 22% of the investigations that we reviewed were either incomplete or partly incomplete, which is not great, but on the other hand, it was a lot better than the year before when it was half. So that's one thing we're seeing about training. It seems like either the training or the supervision of the people in internal affairs could be better. Another was we took a look at the use of police dogs, canine units, and we found that there might be a problem with respect to training here because we reviewed 3 cases in which canines were used to cause some kind of an injury during this reporting period. We have another one that we're still reviewing. And we concluded that in all 3 of those cases, the use of the dog to bite somebody was not consistent with policy. So what we were seeing in the field didn't match the rules that were set up in the sheriff's office's own policies and the applicable laws about when one should and should not use a dog. I think a fair short summary would be that we saw canines being directed to bite people in situations where current law and policy don't allow that. So there was an over response, being too eager to have the dog bite someone. And that makes us think that we should take a close look, the sheriff's office should take a close look at whether their training is actually sufficient, adequate to get the sheriff's deputies to actually follow the policy. That there's some kind of disconnect between what sheriff's deputies are being taught to do with the dogs and what the policy actually says. So hopefully they will be working on that in the next year. I know they've already started looking at their policy again to double check it and see if they think it's right. And I think that's a positive. So hopefully our ability at IOLERO to create more transparency, to give some solid policy recommendations about this trend we see in dog bites is going to result in the sheriff's office changing how they're using the dogs. Now, ultimately, implementing on any of these ideas and recommendations or observations is up to the sheriff's office. Whether they will or will not implement on those is really entirely up to them. We can't force them to do any of these things, but we can create more public attention around it. If you find our annual report material like this is interesting, our website has annual reports available for the last 5 or 6 years, and you can take a look through those and see some of the trends yourself, see what you think.
I had a couple of questions I think we had provided you. I don't know if you want to try to maybe answer some of those at this point, starting with that as was of interest. The Press Democrat recently ran an investigative report about the county's use of Lexapol procedures used by many law enforcement agencies, including Sonoma County, which tend to favor law enforcement, protection of law enforcement officers. Has IOLERO or CAC taken any position on this? Issued any recommendations or gotten involved in this issue at all?
We haven't taken a position either at IOLERO or the CAC about the use of Lexapol in general, but we do provide feedback about specific policies and ways they could be improved. And I think it would be fair to say that our attitude has been that just because a policy comes from Lexapol doesn't mean that it's necessarily ideal or final. And for sure, the policies that come from Lexapol are not designed with any community input, right? They are canned products from a consultant in another part of the state who has their own ideas about what they think best practices are, which may or may not be consistent with the community needs here in Sonoma County, right? So to the extent that the sheriff's office might use products from Lexapol or any other source, we think it's also important that those then be shopped through the community and the community have an opportunity to provide some feedback and the sheriff's office think about that carefully. In fact, some of the policies that have been changed in the last year are policies that were originally from Lexapol and we thought needed some kind of improvement or change. So there are too many policies at the sheriff's office, and the Lexapol library is too vast for us to be able to thoughtfully critique every single one of them. So we haven't taken a position across the board.
Another question, when you were talking earlier about the sheriff being the sheriff and the coroner. I know there's been
Mhm.
concern in a lot of communities about the conflict of interest that exists, especially when the sheriff has deaths in the jail and
Mhm.
they're acting as the coroner and investigating. Have you been involved in any uh, advisory position on this issue with the sheriff? And is there any movement to possibly divide the sheriff and the coroner's office?
I haven't heard of any proposals to divide the coroners and the sheriff's office, but I do know that before I came on, the sheriff's office developed the policy of having a different coroner from another part of the state weigh in on any case that might have been caused by or happened while someone was in the custody of the sheriff. And so, for example, um, if there were an officer involved shooting tomorrow or someone died in the jail tomorrow, um, the coroner that would assess the body would not be the Sonoma County coroner. It would probably be, depending on who was available at the time, Napa or Marin, most likely. It could be even someone else if they needed to. And then likewise, the Sonoma County coroner does the same for other counties. So if there's some other county that's similarly positioned, they can reach out to Sonoma to do that coroner work. And I think that's an improvement. There has been some discussion at the state level of having, particularly in the jail setting, a completely independent review by an autonomous state body that would do all that work. And so, in fact, the bill just passed last year to create a state project like that, where not for the shootings, but for deaths in the jail, there'd be an opportunity for a group kind of like IOLERO, right? But at the state level to independently check out each of those deaths in each of those facilities. It'll be interesting to see how that launches and what it looks like, but it's a very new law, so it hasn't gotten started yet.
That's great. I
Yeah.
wasn't aware of that.
Mhm.
Our league here is interested in criminal justice, and we were wondering if you could maybe suggest ways where we might help advocate for IOLERO, especially in ways to get the sheriff department to respond or address the findings that you made.
Well, I think there are a couple ways to do that. So one of them is that if anyone, has a lot of interest and a little bit of time, we do periodically have openings on our community advisory council. Those positions right now are appointed by the Board of Supervisors instead of the director of IOLERO. That was a change in Measure P in 2020. And I think that's good in that it really makes sure that there's a wide variety of voices at the table and that they're folks who have connection to the community. So right now there's an opening in the 5th district. So that's the district that Linda Hopkins represents and is generally the western part of the county in Sebastopol. And so if anyone, is interested in being on the Community Advisory Council and lives in that district, that's a vacancy we have right now. Another way that you can get involved is that the CAC has ad hocs or small committees that work on specific projects. You do not have to be a member of the Community Advisory Council to participate in one of those ad hocs. So, right now there are some ad hocs going that certainly could use the help of individuals who have some time and interest, and particularly if you have some subject matter expertise, that's even better. Not required, but even better. And some of those involve the hiring and recruiting practices at the sheriff's office. Another one involves how the sheriff's office is responding to or assessing data the state has recently required the sheriff's office to make public about the racial and gender demographics of the people that the sheriff's office stops, either in traffic stops or other detentions or arrests. And as you might imagine, that shows a significant racial disparity with Blacks and Latinos in Sonoma County being stopped at rates vastly higher than their percentage in the population. Figuring out why that is and what we might do about that is a project that's just really started. There has also been interest at the CAC in digging deeper into the canine policy and training that I mentioned earlier from our annual report. And the folks who are working on that could always use, some additional help. So you've got lots of opportunities there to get engaged in really specific issues. We'll do a retreat for the CAC, likely in February, because that's when we did it last year, where we'll invite both the public and the CAC members to meet together in a relatively informal way to have conversation about what the CAC's priorities should be in the next year. So if you're interested in suggesting ideas to the CAC, that would be a great time. So stay on top of our website, and once we get a date, we'll make sure that gets announced. And there are a variety of groups out there that have been really active in advocating for IOLERO's funding and authority. One of those groups is called CLEAN, which is a coalition of legal and social justice groups who helped put Measure P on the ballot in the first place. And those folks have been very active at advocating for change at the sheriff's office, but also in supporting the CAC and IOLERO. So that's another way you could get involved.
Great, thanks. I think you answered pretty much all of the other questions. I don't know if anyone else, looks like Leona's got her hand up.
Oh, Leona, you're muted still.
Can you put up a slide about future plans for IOLERO? I think you had mentioned that in one of the.
Yeah,
It
sure.
would be interesting to hear about.
Give me just a moment. Okay, so this is a slide from our annual report presentation. It talks a little bit about what we're planning to do in the next year. So in the next year, 2020, in this regards fiscal year 2023, 2024, we're working on building out some of the programs that were described in Measure P, but only became operable just last year after we resolved the issues with PERB and meet and confer with the unions. And those include how exactly we might audit civil cases. So one of the things that Measure P says is that we should be auditing not just the Internal Affairs Division cases that are coming through, but also any cases where a civil suit is filed against the county, and there's some claim in the civil suit of violation of civil rights by the sheriff's office. So a typical example would be a use of force case where someone says they feel they were the victim of excessive force at the hands of a sheriff's deputy. We've already started some of that work, and we're sort of fine-tuning our approach. So some of the cases that you'll see in our annual reports now come from the civil case auditing power. We are rolling out this year a whistleblower program, meaning that somebody who is a private citizen who someone who's not a private citizen but is an employee of the county who thinks they have seen some misconduct internally at the sheriff's office can make a report to us about that. We haven't had a large number of those kinds of whistleblower complaints, but we are launching a portal where people can make those complaints anonymously if they want to, and give us whatever information they might have, including images or videos or other things like that, so we can better investigate those. Those are one of the few categories of cases that we're able to directly investigate. And then there'll be more work on our investigative power generally. So this is the first year we'll be doing interviews of sheriff's deputies, creating reports about some of these independent investigations, and almost certainly having some of those in our annual report for next year. The second thing we're doing, which is maybe not as exciting but as essential, is building some of the infrastructure we need internally to do our work. So we're creating an interview room here at our agency. The office space we have isn't ideal for doing interviews of deputies right now, but it will be. And then we have a new database that we're using to track all of our work. It'll make it easier for us to create our annual reports and stay on top of the work. So that's, again, not flashy, but important work to do. A third thing we're working on right now is creating our own internal policy and procedure manual so people can understand what we do and how we do it and why, so that at least our work at IOLERO is more transparent. And then finally, much like we put together the completeness guidelines for the sheriff, explaining to them how we're going to judge their cases, we're currently putting together some timeliness guidelines so that we have a routine that we're using in our office, so we're consistently measuring the same way against all cases, and so that we've given some advance notice to the sheriff of what our yardstick is, so they're not surprised if we reach conclusions at the end of our auditing process. So those are some of the things we're working on right now, and I think you'll see us working on a wider variety and a larger number of cases by this time next year. Another thing that's interesting about our current situation is that we've had a really significant increase in the number of cases that come through. This is a slide about that. We received last fiscal year 53 complaints from the public. But we also had 27 different cases that we audited that year. So that suggests if we're auditing 27 cases in a year, finishing 27, but got 53 new ones in, our caseload is more or less doubling. That's an oversimplification for a variety of reasons. It's probably even a bigger set of cases than that. But everything we're seeing suggests that our caseload is going to dramatically increase over the next couple of years by a factor of 2 or 3 times. So it's good we have some more staff on. I think we might need some more staff in our next budget cycle to keep up with all those audits. So it's a lot of work, and I can't really say exactly why we're getting more complaints. It's hard to know. I'm cautiously optimistic that some of that is because people who have had complaints for a long time have a higher degree of confidence that something's actually going to come of their complaint, that it's worth making the complaint. I don't know that that's true. It's very hard to say, but I would like to think that we're creating a greater sense of confidence that complaints matter.
Yeah, that's great. Well, looks like there's 2 more questions in the queue. Maybe you have time for the one of them because we're getting close to the end here.
Sure.
Do you receive many complaints involving interactions of the sheriff personnel with persons with mental illness, either in the field or in the jail? And are there any specific policies that deal with this subject?
Yes. So that's a great question. There are some policies about de-escalation at the sheriff's office when using force, and that sheriff's deputies are supposed to take into account whether they think there are signs that the person they're dealing with is suffering from mental illness and therefore should be dialing down the amount of force that they're using, because confrontational behavior from law enforcement is much more likely to create confrontational behavior back from someone with mental illness than is calm behavior. That's one example of one of the policies they have. I do think that across law enforcement, the training about how to deal with people with mental illness could be better. And one of the things the state has done that I think will be a big help in that regard is mandate that every county have a process for providing mental health clinicians as a first response call, kind of like a police officer showing up or a firefighter showing up, in lieu of having law enforcement show up first. So imagine you call 911 and they say, do you need police or fire or parking, right? Help. And you could say, none of those, I need someone to help with a mental health crisis. And so be like, we have someone just like that. We have a team, 2 people, you know, a social worker and a licensed clinician who are then going to come out and respond together and see what the mental health crisis is and what we can do to provide assistance, right? So an unarmed, non-law enforcement, calmer kind of response. Sonoma County is building that system now. This is a very new state mandate, just came into play last year. It's going to be a really heavy lift to create that this year. That's not something that we're directly involved in at IOLERO. The County Department of Health is the one who's providing that service primarily, but we think that is fantastic. And while there are challenges to the funding and the staffing of such a model, right? We do think on a policy level that's the better response. So hopefully that takes a whole set of 911 calls that normally would have gone to a sheriff's deputy or a police officer, and give those instead to people who have more appropriate tools and training. And that allows folks in law enforcement to respond more rapidly to situations where an armed law enforcement response really is appropriate.
Thank you. Well, the last question was, and it's probably pretty relevant, and then we can close out. Does the Board of Supervisors get a quarterly report on the sheriff's settlements?
I am not directly involved in creating that flow of information to the Board of Supervisors, but it is the case in every county that the Board of Supervisors has to approve settlements of such cases. And so they have an opportunity to talk to their attorneys, the county counsel's office and whatever counsel they might have hired on those cases about the individual cases and what the settlements are going to be and why they might authorize a settlement of a certain amount. Even if there's insurance involved, they still have to do that. And so in that regard, the Board of Supervisors is very intimately involved with all of those settlements.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure, yeah, they know exactly what they're paying out, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would like to thank you so much for taking the time to give us this presentation.
Oh, Rick has one
And-
last quick question, hopefully.
I missed that. Do you have time for one more question? I don't want to
Sure.
keep you.
I've got time. I don't want to keep you too long, but I have time.
Okay, go ahead, Rick.
Thank you. John, you began your presentation today with recapitulating the story of Andy Lopez's murder. This is 10 years later. Now we have IOLERO. I'm wondering if you could comment at all on what the effect of having an IOLERO now would have on a situation like that, either before it unrolled or in the aftermath of it.
Well, if that happened today, I mean, hopefully it doesn't, but if it were to happen today, then the public would at least know that there's an independent investigation by IOLERO separate from the sheriff's office investigation. That we'd have the ability to recommend a finding as to whether there is misconduct, and if so, what finding, right? And also recommend discipline to the sheriff, and that report would be publicly available. One wouldn't have to fight for years to get it, as was the case with some of the materials in the Andy Lopez case that were withheld from the public for very long periods of time. And I think increased community distrust of the overall law enforcement system and the sheriff's office in particular. I cannot guarantee that that would prevent a situation like the Andy Lopez case from happening in the first place, because we can't directly control every sheriff's deputy, right? But I do think that that would create a much stronger and more immediate way to provide feedback to the individual deputies and also to the sheriff's office about how their policies and training could be different. From my experience, it's because of civilian oversight agencies like the ones we have in other parts of California over police departments, that state law really dramatically changed about 2 years ago to require de-escalation and what's called proportionality, meaning, you know, a slower response, creating more time and distance when police officers arrive at a scene, and then making sure the level of force they're using matches the level of resistance they're experiencing. Those are new and different requirements than we've ever had in California before. Back when Andy Lopez was killed, the laws we had in California about how officers used force were literally written in the 1870s and allowed for uses of force that are not constitutional today. It was that old. So I'm really glad that we have that improvement in state law, and I don't think that would have happened without civilian oversight agencies like this one, you know, identifying that problem and advocating for a change in state law. So I think in that regard, we can see that civilian oversight in California writ large, not just IOLERO, has created really substantive, meaningful differences in state law around how officers use force. And I am optimistic that over time, that will result in fewer people being unnecessarily killed by law enforcement than has been the case in the past. So at any rate, great question.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, John, for taking the time to do this presentation. It was very interesting and informative, and I'm so glad that you're having an ability to make some change and make a difference. We look
Thanks,
forward
Jody.
to hearing more.
I'll make sure to send to you and Leona the PowerPoints, and
would
then
be
you
great.
can share those with your membership if you care to. And
I'm
again,
gonna
there
try
are
to
lots of
get
links in there.
I'm going to try to get this posted on our YouTube channel as well.
Oh, fantastic. That'd be
Unfortunately, I
great.
cut off. The first few minutes were not on recorded, so I'm not sure what to do about that, but thank you. Really
Yes, thank you
appreciate it.
very much.
Presentation. Thank you.
Been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Uh-huh.
Take care.
You're
Talk
welcome.
to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Right. See y'all later.
Thank you, Jody.
You're welcome. Bye.